All right, so this is our external review of sheep brain anatomy. Remember, just to start off with, that anything towards the front of the brain, this would be considered rostral. Towards the back of the brain is considered caudal. Anything along the midline would be considered medial, and towards the edges is lateral. Right now we're looking at a ventral view of the brain, that's the bottom. If we were talking about the top of the brain, this is dorsal. So dorsal meaning towards the top, ventral meaning towards the bottom, lateral means towards the edges, medial towards the center, rostral towards the front, and caudal means towards the back. So if we begin here with the front of the brain, the first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, where this is the remains of the olfactory bulbs, and their information will be entering into the brain through the olfactory nerve. And what we can see here along the side, going from about this black line to about right here, this is the lateral olfactory gyrus. So the gyrus is any bump in the brain, a sulcus, or a fissure is any groove or dip in the brain. This right here, this bump going along here, this is the lateral olfactory gyrus. It's got a stripe going along this edge right here that's known as the lateral olfactory stria. In Latin, stria means stripe. So this white line going along right here is the lateral olfactory stria, which is part of this lateral olfactory gyrus. Between both of these gyri, this one and this one, this area right here is known as the anterior perforated substance. Anterior because it's towards the front of the brain. Perforated because there's actually larger spaces between brain tissue, allowing blood to flow in there. And substance because they couldn't really think of a more creative name for that, I guess. So anterior perforated substance that's right here. Just behind that is our optic chiasm. So this is the second cranial nerve, is the optic nerve. You can imagine the eyeballs are out here in space. Thank goodness they're not attached because that'd be kind of gross. But the fibers leaving the eye are known as the optic nerve. So it creates our adorable brain mustache right here. But this optic nerve, some of these fibers will cross over to the other side of the brain right here at the optic chiasm. So chi in Latin means X, and that's kind of what we have happening right here. It's this crossing of fibers at the optic chiasm. So we have the optic nerve here on this side. It'll go through the optic chiasm, these fibers, and then on the other side of this is known as the optic tract. Just caudal to that, we can see there's this hole. If you weren't able to see the hole instead of black stuff covering over this, that's likely to be the infundibulum, which is a stalk that attaches the pituitary gland, which would be sitting out here somewhere. Not technically part of the brain, but attached to it via the infundibulum, which in turn is attached to the brain by a ring of tissue surrounding this hole, known as the median eminence. The median eminence is the tissue surrounding this hole. And if we were to put a pin here, for example, during the practicum, into that hole, and we were to ask, name the tissue surrounding this space, and name the space inside the brain this pin is going through, the tissue surrounding this would be the median eminence, and the space inside the brain the pin is going through is the third ventricle. So any space inside the brain is known as a ventricle. Any space outside the brain we refer to as being a cistern. So that hole enters into the third ventricle, which is inside the brain. Just caudal to the third ventricle hole here that we have, just caudal to the median eminence, we have this sort of triangular shaped bit of tissue. This is known as the mammillary bodies. So it's kind of got a white color to it. And it is the only part of the diencephalon that we can see from the outside of the brain. We'll be able to see more structures once we do a sagittal cut along the brain, along the midline here. We'll see more structures of the diencephalon, but from the outside of the brain, really all we can see is the mammillary bodies right here. Just lateral to the mammillary bodies are some bulges. We got this bulge happening right here, and a bulge happening right here. These guys are known as the cerebral peduncles, or as I call them, the cerebral peduncaduncs. They have these little fettuccine looking type noodle things happening right here. They're very flat and wide. There's also one right here. These guys are the oculomotor nerves. They control 4 of the 6 muscles that move your eyes. So we've got the oculomotor nerves coming off of the cerebral peduncle, and there's this space right here that's outside the brain. This space right here is referred to as the interpeduncular cistern. Inter meaning between these two guys, which are peduncles, so interpeduncular, and since it's a space outside the brain, it's known as a cistern. So here's our interpeduncular cistern, and if we move just caudal to that, we get to this bulge right here, which is known as the pons. Together, the pons and the cerebellum make up our metencephalon. And the pons actually has a fiber bundle connecting it with the cerebellum here so that they can communicate, which is known as the brachium pontus. Brachium meaning arms in Latin. I consider it the arms of the pons reaching out, and it's giving the cerebellum a hug because they're friends. They like to talk a lot with each other, and they do that through the brachium pontus, which are these fibers running that way. Just caudal to the pons, we have the medulla right here. That's this last bulge that we see in the brain. And right off of the most rostral part of the medulla, we can see we've got a couple little fibers happening right here. These are the abducens. We've got one on this side, one on this side. That's the abducens. And they're coming from the most anterior portion of the medulla, the most rostral portion of the medulla, right before we get to the pons. There are also a couple other fiber tracts that are running along the medulla. The ones that go right along the midline right here are known as the pyramidal tract. So you can kind of see, if we remove the pia mater, you'll be able to see it more clearly, but there's a bulge happening right here and one happening right here off of the medulla. These fiber tracts are known as the pyramidal tract, right there and right there. And they get all the way to the most front part of the medulla where they hit what's known as the trapezoid bodies, which is going along right here. This is the trapezoid body running along the most anterior portion of the medulla. And then if we flip our brain over here, we've got our cerebrum and our cerebellum. This means big brain and little brain. If we look here towards this very back end and we, slippery brain, pull back the brain stem from the cerebellum, this space outside the brain is known as the cisterna magna. And if we move this way and pull this guy back, you can kind of see a V shape happening here. So there's kind of that line come together at this tip of the V. That guy right there is known as the obex. So the tip of that V shape. So we got this side and that side come together at the tip of this V. That's the obex. The space inside the brain right here, this is the fourth ventricle. So between the cerebellum and the brain stem is the fourth ventricle if we're looking at a space inside the brain. Outside the brain, this is the cisterna magna. And if we look up here, the space outside the brain between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, this space right here is known as the superior cistern. If we pull this back and look underneath here, we can see two large bulgy masses here. This is the superior colliculus right here, these two things. Superior colliculus, superior colliculus. Just below that, these guys that kind of are smushed out to the side, this is the inferior colliculus. So we got one right here, one right over here. I don't know why the superior colliculus is so large in sheep compared to their inferior colliculus, because honestly, it's not like they have that much better visual reflexes, but we have a huge superior colliculus relative to their kind of tiny inferior colliculus over here on each side. So from the external view, the superior and inferior colliculus, this part right here, along with the cerebral peduncles, which remember are these bulges right here, those together make the mesencephalon. Continuing over here, we've got a few other gyri and sulci listed on your list, so we'll continue through those. So we're going to the front of the brain now. And you can see this line that goes up. So here's our longitudinal fissure. It separates the two hemispheres of the brain. Goes right along here all the way back. So you have a right and a left hemisphere of the brain. This sulcus that runs more or less parallel to that longitudinal fissure kind of goes parallel, but it's kind of sort of like wiggle, 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 yeah. Wiggle, 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 yeah. This guy right here is known as the superior frontal sulcus. Superior because it's on the top of the brain, frontal because it's in this frontal lobe, and because it's a little dip or groove in the brain, we refer to it as a sulcus. So superior frontal sulcus, superior frontal sulcus. And it keeps going back until it stops right here at this next, what's actually called a fissure. So we got one on this side. We got another one right here on this side. This guy that it stops at, it kind of makes a T shape. So you got here's like the bottom part of the T. There's the top part of the T. This is known as the cruciate fissure. Cruciate like cross, T's like a cross. That's how I tend to remember it. So we've got the cruciate fissure that runs along here till it kind of stops. About right there, it stops. So cruciate fissure running along those top parts. Superior frontal sulcus goes up until it hits the cruciate fissure. Cruciate fissure runs along this side until about here it stops. Now if we jump over this gyrus to the next sulcus we see here, this is known as the Sylvian sulcus. Sylvian sulcus runs right along the side here through this little dimple in the brain. This dimple right here is known as the insula, and in Latin that means island. Now in the human brain, evolutionary pressure has caused this part of the cortex to grow over as well as this part to grow over. So the insula really is like an island. If you were to carve away this portion of the cortex in a human brain, you'd find more cortex under there. It's like a Russian nesting doll of cortices. There's just a cortex, under a cortex, under a cortex, it seems like. Maybe just one of the cortex under the cortex. Anyway, on the sheep, it hasn't quite had the same kind of evolutionary pressure, so it shows up more as this dimple in the brain that we call the insula. Now, if we're looking at the side of the brain here from this lateral view, remember this was the lateral olfactory gyrus, and the sulcus, or fissure that's separating the, that's kind of providing one portion of that bump there, the one edge point. This fissure running along the brain is known as the rhinal fissure. You can see it over here on this side as well. So there's our lateral olfactory stria. This is the lateral olfactory gyrus right here. And this fissure running along right here, this is the rhinal fissure. Just above the rhinal fissure is where we find the insula, and that sulcus we have running through the insula is the Sylvian sulcus. We can jump over this gyrus to get back to that cruciate fissure that runs along the top right here and makes a T with the superior frontal sulcus here. The rhinal fissure, going back to this guy, is separating neocortex, which is newer cortex, from this evolutionarily older cortex known as allocortex. This gyrus right here that's part of the allocortex is known as the hippocampal gyrus. It's called the hippocampal gyrus because the hippocampus is sitting right underneath this gyrus. Makes sense, right? The very tippy topmost point of this hippocampal gyrus, so where it bumps out the most, if we were to stick a pin right through right there, and we said, number one, name this gyrus, and number two, name the nucleus that sits just underneath this cortex, the gyrus would be considered the hippocampal gyrus, and the nucleus that sits at the very end of the hippocampus is known as the amygdala, one of those major emotional processing areas of the brain. So the amygdala is sitting right at the end of the hippocampus. The hippocampus would normally be extending back along that way. We can't see it because it's, we're looking at cortex. We're not looking at the actual inside the cortex yet. The hippocampus sits just inside the cortex, with the amygdala being right at the tip of where we see this gyrus. So if we were to cut through the tissue right here, making a coronal cut and looking then head on this way, this would be going right through the amygdala right there.